So, when you talk about innovation, there's lots of sexy stuff going on, new technology, wearables, opportunity to get involved with analyzing huge amounts of data. I'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that innovation takes a long time. When people talk about transformation, innovation. Oh, I'm doing that. So wait. Innovation takes a substantial amount of time, no matter what we talk about. So if you look at some of the innovations in clinical development, really over the last 30 or so years, you can go right back to the late 80s, up into the sort of the mid 2010s, and really it takes 15, 20 years for these things to come through. You look at EDC, electronic data capture. That's the way we record data in a clinical trial. It used to be on paper. In my day, when I started, it was on a paper. Nowadays, it's more electronic, but we still do paper trials. There's still about 5% of the trials we run in our company are recording data on paper. As strange as that may seem, that's still the case. And so we started that in the early 90s. We're still, it's probably 30 years, and we're still doing that. And I think that's the background you have to understand and talk about innovation in clinical trials. Transformational overstates it. We don't do much in terms of transformational. We do incremental. And having said that, though, I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity to really look at what we do. We were able to get that Pfizer vaccine to market really within a year, about 250 days from the start of that trial to the emergency use application. That is unprecedented, totally unprecedented. And the other companies have done a similar job in terms of moving those vaccines along. And so it does give us an opportunity to really think about what do we do at that time? How do we get those drugs to market so quickly? And what can we do going forward to repeat that and to make that more a standard of operation than falling back to the older days of many, many years, 12 years, I think, in Chris's slide, to get a drug to market. That's still typically the case, but I think we can do better as we go forward. So for today, I wanted to look at a couple of themes in terms of the industry panic. Certainly in terms of increased patient centricity. You've all heard the term. People wonder what does that actually mean. I think we're seeing that in terms of decentralized trials. We're all moving to more working from home. Well, trials are moving to home as well, and the opportunity, the ability to run clinical trials in a home setting is much more available now with the technology that we have in our pockets, on our wrists, everywhere about, that we're able to collect that sort of data. So I'll talk a bit about patient centricity and the ability of patients to be involved. We need more patients involved in clinical trials. Only something like 3 to 5% of people have ever been involved in a clinical trial. That's an astonishingly low number, and it really does drive the cost of clinical development. When you only have that number of people involved, it's very difficult to reduce the cost, to be more efficient. And so going forward, getting more people involved in a clinical trial and democratizing the whole system of clinical trials, I think, is an area that I'd love to see, expand. And I do think we have an opportunity. People understand what a clinical trial is now. I think there's a much greater awareness of what those are and what the contribution those clinical trials made, particularly around the vaccines from the pandemic. My mother understands what I do now after 35 years, which the technology adoption in healthcare. I mean, there's been a real. Chris talked about the revolution in science, and I think on the right we can certainly see that with the messenger RNA, the CAR T, cell and gene therapy. But he's given a very nice overview of what revolution has happened there, the checkpoint inhibitors, etc., etc. On the technology side, there's been a similar sort of development. As I say, with the phones we have in our pocket, with the wearables, with the ability to access electronic medical records in a way that brings data to the fore and allows us to analyze very large quantities of data in a way that we've never been able to do in the past. That gives us, I think, a huge opportunity to be more innovative and creative. You think about synthetic controls in a clinical trial, typically a randomized controlled trial. One of the greatest inventions of the 20th century, I suppose, unquestionably, but it's a pretty inefficient mechanism when you think about it. You put one patient on a new drug and you randomize another to a similar number of patients to the placebo or to the control. you're kind of, in some ways, wasting half your resources as you randomise those patients. Important as it is to make those comparisons, the opportunity, I think, going forward is with the huge amount of data we have to have these synthetic controls where you actually get to look at a vast number of patients in a control group that have the disease you're looking at and then compare against the active. I think those sort of opportunities going forward in terms of design, how we get do clinical trials, and how we get drugs to market, offer huge opportunity. So those are the sort of themes we'll sort of touch upon a bit more as I go through the talk today. In terms of the CRO industry, just to drill down a little more, patient access to clinical trials. We're trying to move to a point where, as I said, the awareness of clinical trials has increased, and we have, I think, a great opportunity to get more people involved in the clinical trial, to make clinical research a care option. When you go to your doctor, you have the ability to be treated with a registered drug, but you also have an option to go into a clinical trial. How many people, when you go to your primary care physician, have the opportunity to go into a clinical trial? I've never been offered one in certainly all the time I've been going to doctors. I suspect most of you probably haven't as well. We need to give those options, and I'll talk a little bit about where we're going with broadening that potential for people to be involved in clinical trials going forward. 3 to 5% is not enough. It needs to be 30%, 40%, 50% of people being involved or potentially being involved in clinical trials. There's certainly a high demand for research. There's a focus on diversity of clinical trial enrollment now. Certainly through the pandemic, the regulators were very strict on us as we enrolled those 45,000 patients into the large phase 3 trial that we did, in terms of not just retrospectively looking at diversity in the trials, but prospectively. And we actually halted recruitment at certain sites and in certain countries because they were moving right down one particular racial line, or they weren't diverse enough. We had to manage that, and that's the first time I've certainly seen that in my career of running clinical trials. They were proactively addressing that problem, and it's a very important issue. You can't continue to do trials in one particular ethnic group and expect those results to be valid across the world. And so there's a much greater awareness now, not just of diversity within organisations and boards and all that, but diversity of patients who participate in clinical trials and the benefits of that in terms of the validity of the trial results. So you look at the options there for moving forward as clinical research as a care option. And that's something I think we passionately believe in, and we want to see developing some connections with sites around Veridon. I'll talk in a moment about that. The fitting trials into the patient's lives, again, that patient centricity side of things is also particularly important. The telehealth option, people like, some physicians hate it, some people love it, but it does have a role to play, particularly in a decentralised trial environment. We are increasingly moving towards probably not fully decentralised trials, they're still pretty rare, but those hybrid trials where there are components of the management of the trial, of the recruitment of the trial that are decentralised, certainly there at the moment. Again, in that large Pfizer trial, we have people monitoring data. Most of the monitoring we did on that data, which we had to do, was not people being on site physically monitoring data, physically looking at the data, physically doing the source data verification. When I was a boy, 30 years ago, when I used to go out and monitor, I would go and I would look at, you would look at the case report forms and you would look at the source data and you would be going, oh, yes, that's that data. That sort of laborious process was very much a part of what we've done, even though it still happens. But we've moved it, we certainly moved it during the pandemic to being remote and being able to look at data, so having access to electronic health records through technology on an off-site basis that allowed us to make sure that source data was moving into the electronic data capture system, electronic database essentially, allowed us to be a lot more efficient. We had people in Japan monitoring data in Argentina. That was the sort of the sort of logistics we were able to implement, and that makes us more efficient. And as we do that more and more often, we are going to be able to reduce the costs of those clinical trials, which I think is an absolutely fundamental part of where we need to go as an organisation. The technology and the data driving smart decisions. not just do we have that technology to avail ourselves of the information and of the data, but we can analyze that data, we can look at that data, we can follow up and we can generate that data and make sure that the data we generate allows us to take action. I'll talk a bit about tokenization, the ability for us now to collect data from patients from various sources and tokenize that in a de-identified manner and allow us to follow those patients on a longer term basis. I was talking to a biotech customer yesterday who has a CAR T a treatment that's coming that they want to do a trial in. The follow-up is 5 years. 2 years to recruit the study. It's an 8-year study, but follow-up is 5 years, and they have to do that. They need to say what the sort of duration of response is. But that's a very, again, resource-intensive sort of problem for them at the moment. But tokenizing, the ability to actually identify these patients and then watch their data or collect the data from various sources, not just within the clinical trial, but other sources, and follow those patients along is in a more automated manner, really gives us the opportunity to follow up on those patients and make sure that they are benefiting from the treatment continues to be safe, etc., etc. And so there are great opportunities, again, through that technology to be more efficient. I'll keep moving, and this is as we get down to a more the decentralized approach on clinical trials and the opportunities and inevitably challenges that we take. And as I talked about at the start, this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. We are in a situation where decentralizing clinical trials offers this huge opportunity, but it's going to take some time to move through. But things we can do better in terms of fit for purpose protocols, in terms of having the patients more involved in the sort of data that's being collected, patient-centric endpoints that mean something to a patient. Back to Chris's point about getting the patients more involved and having the patients at the centre of a clinical trial, it's important that we measure what's important to the patient. It's great to have biochemical endpoints and all the rest of it, but we need to make sure that we're measuring what's important to them and we're registering drugs on the basis of what's important to them. The real-time data, as I mentioned, the ability for us to collect data on a real-time basis is really quite mind-blowing these days. You can collect huge amounts of data literally in a real-time basis. Every day, every hour, you can see that data accumulate. The problem probably is not so much the data, collecting the data, there's so much of it. What do you look at? What do you analyze? How do you manage all this data? Because there is so much available, and there's always the tendency as scientists, we always want to measure every little piece, every little bit, and as what happens then is you collect so much data, you have to report it all, it gives you all sorts of logistical problems. But the opportunity there, certainly in a selective manner, to collect it in a real-time basis and to correct the trials as they're going along. You see something going off track, we can monitor that remotely, we can see what's happening at the site, we can see that the site's not treating the right patients, or there are patients that are going a little, and we can intervene there. That is unprecedented now as we go forward in this technology-oriented world. The ability and, of course, the opportunity to look at that data, to analyze that data, to work with that data does require different skill sets, and certainly our people who've been traditionally going out and managing clinical trials need to evolve. We need to evolve them in terms of how they look at information, how they look at that accumulating data, and how they manage the sites and how they manage the patients ultimately going forward. It's an important change management process that we need to put in place through our development organisation to make sure that they recognise the challenges of what the new world brings. There are, of course, a number of challenges, and I've put a few there. The regulatory standards, the commercial model maturity. The regulators have certainly been very open in terms of decentralised clinical trials, providing guidance, but they're learning as everyone else is as well. And there's always a tendency, as I said, to be fairly conservative in these sorts of areas. Privacy regulations are a challenge. There's no question about it, particularly in Europe. You know of the GDPR. We haven't moved quite that far in the United States. I hope we don't, because I think there needs to be a balance between privacy and the absolutely legitimate requirements for people's private information to be kept confidential. But we can use that data, I think, in a way that does de-identify and does allow us to get the benefits from it. And I think in some cases, we've gone a little bit too far down one end of the spectrum rather than the other. My fundamental belief is people are generally altruistic and want to be able to help medical treatments get to market, and they're quite willing to have their data albeit on a de-identified basis, be available to that. So I think there's an opportunity for regulators to tread that middle line. Always a challenging one, of course, but it is an area that I think we need to continue to be vigilant. And then on the commercial side, people always say, no, decentralized trials, of course, they're going to be cheaper, right? They're going to be much, much cheaper. It'll be much more cost effective. You know, that was what they said about electronic data capture and informed consent and all of those things. You know, I've got to be honest and say I don't see it being cheap, at least not in the short term. In the longer term, yes, it must get to be more effective. It must get to be cheaper. Again, Chris's slide showed how many billions of dollars were spent per drug coming to market and how that's going down. Interestingly, it's even worse than that, because we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years the number of drugs approved by the FDA actually has gone up significantly over the last 5 or 10 years, like 50, 55 it was last year. That's more than it was, say, 10, 20 years ago. But it just shows you, for spending that much amount of the productivity is going down, how much more money we're spending to get those drugs to market. And there are various reasons for that, rare diseases, et cetera, et cetera. But it's clearly, it's not really a sustainable area. We do need to be more cost effective as we go forward. Again, just to give a flavour of the sort of ecosystem that revolves around a clinical trial and a decentralised clinical trial, whether it be a site network, a site support area in the Firecrest area there. Care Innovations is our platform. These are platforms that we have patients connect to. So they get support, they can provide information for their ePro, their patient-reported outcomes. They can answer questions, they can provide that data on a real-time basis. We have an in-home services group as well who connects with those patients who can come and do the phlebotomy or make the assessments. Those are not cheap services. Again, you're going out to individual patients, which does tend to drive cost. But you probably get a better clinical trial. You get patients, again, a more diverse patient group. You get a more engaged patient group. And you can probably get a result in your trial if your drug works, and that's an if. If it works, you'll find that result probably more effectively in a decentralized trial that's managed in this way. So we're optimistic that these trials will tend to be adopted and taken on board. Again, the regulators will be largely, or will have an important impact on how quickly that happens. Because I don't think there's been a drug yet registered that's been totally based on a decentralized trial. We're moving towards, we've done several fully decentralized trials now, so that will happen in the next few years. But again, the question I always get from customers when I pitch them a decentralized trial is, okay, well, how many drugs have you got to market based on a decentralized trial? The answer, of course, is none. And so why would I go that way? Why would I want to do that when the traditional pathway is the more traditional way of running a clinical trial? So it's a little chicken and egg, as anything in our industry, and we have to be, we have to continue to push it forward. As I said, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to do that. This is a way too complicated slide, and really I'm just trying to give you a sense of that we are trying to put the patient in the centre here, the middle of the trial, and giving them access to the study apps, to the wearables and sensors, to the reported outcomes areas, home visits, telemedicine, and they are the centre. So we have a training and an investigator at the top, sort of coming across or looking across the trial from start to finish. But the patient is at the middle of it, and that's a pretty fundamental change. I'd say in a more traditional clinical trial setting, it's the site, it's the investigator, it's the doctor who is at the centre of the clinical trial. This is a shift, and it's a quite fundamental shift, I think. And it's not, again, going to happen tomorrow. It'll take a substantial period of time, but it is an important shift, I think, to move that patient to be at the centre of that clinical trial and to be at the centre of the thinking around how we plan, manage, and deliver clinical trials. This is where this point I wanted to make was around making clinical research as that care option. One of the initiatives that we've had put in place at ICON is a relationship with Veradigm, which allows us to access something like 23,000 investigators around the country. It's US focused, where we can get access to their electronic medical records. We can link that up to the electronic data capture system, so we're not having people go out and check paper to paper or system to system. It's already happened. We can get much more efficient in the way we do that. We can also look at where the patients are. We can look at the electronic records and say, okay, we have these patients at this site, and we've moved, we sort of bring the site to the patients rather than the other way around at the moment, where we get a site and then we go find patients to come to that site. It's a more, again, it's a more decentralised, more democratised one of running a clinical trial. So we need to get in place just-in-time activation. Sorry, give me back. So, I went with the dot. Yeah. Okay. So on the right there, I want to try the pointer again. Just-in-time site activation, standard, all that sort of stuff. But we're going. These aren't going to be cell and gene therapy trials. These are more standard chronic ambulatory trials where we're going to physicians or sites who have the patients and who have the ability to recruit those patients, and we look at their and we bring those in and we make that whole process much more efficient. Again, it's something we've just started. We haven't run any trials with it yet. We're sort of setting trials up in that space. But again, it's a way of getting clinical research as that care option, as an option for patients as they come to their doctor. Oh, you have rheumatoid arthritis. You can take the approved therapy for it, or you can go into this new clinical trial. We have that option for you. And I think that's very important. Important what we're trying to do as a development organisation. This is the tokenization side of things. We have a proprietary tool called Sonoma. We run through our Symphony data group, and the data comes from various sources: lab records, prescription records, electronic health records. But we're able to track patients, on a long-term basis. So while they may be involved in a clinical trial, where of course their data is intensively collected, importantly, and most regulators looking for this, are looking for that long-term follow-up, and that can be, as I said, for an extended period of time. And so tokenizing those patients, collecting the data, not just from the clinical trial, but collecting it from the various sources, labs, real-world evidence, genomics, all of those. And the sources are not complete, and this is very much a US-focused initiative at the moment. We're not able to do it globally. But it's an area that we're very keen to see continue, because I think it's, again, a way of innovating and making us much more efficient and effective in collecting data and collecting outcomes. At the end of the day, we want to know those patients continue to be safe, and the treatments that have, particularly the gene therapy situation, that therapy continues to be effective. And those are the sort of questions we'd be asking and answering, I think, in these sort of situations. Not to mention, from a safety point of view, I'm sure the Merck guys would have loved to have had something like this going when BIOS came up, to put those events in context. There are millions of patients being treated. We've got a signal here. How can we put it in context? If we had this sort of system, we'd be able to look at it and go, well, there's certainly some events, but there are many patients who haven't had that event. Here's the denominator, here's the numerator, and here's the sort of incidence and prevalence, and we can put those things in context much more effectively than perhaps we've been able to do in the past. So that's one of the areas we're going to. And then finally, for us, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, a lot of this is being applied in the clinical trial setting. We're sort of starting out fairly slowly, looking at filing of documents and those sorts of things. But the opportunity really is around, again, identifying patients for clinical trials. And we've been able to start moving forward with a group called Deep Lens, who have an ability to have a system called the Viper that can look at, again, electronic medical records and match up oncology protocols with those records, and then identify those patients that are suitable for the trial, and then identify it and allow the site then to be aware of them, and then to reach out to those patients and say, so instead of nurses and study site investigators trawling through study charts and data and electronic records, this is done automatically. So there's, again, some really cool stuff being done here. We're allowing us to find patients increasingly, as you know, we do trials in rare diseases, and not just that, pretty much every oncology disease at the moment is a rare disease. They're always looking at mutations and submutations, et cetera, et cetera. And so finding these patients, because they typically move through that stage, in some cases very quickly, is very important. They're not patients who are sitting out there for weeks and days and months and years, ready to be recruited into a trial. They're probably eligible for that trial for a very short period of time. The ability to identify those patients and give them the opportunity to move into a clinical trial is critical, and we're doing that through this sort of technology. So I think that's a little bit of a flavour for some of the things that are going on. Again, a little bit of a potted history on innovation, but nonetheless,
I have one question, which is, we talked about the first speaker talked about innovation, drug development, et cetera. What does innovation look like when it comes to clinical trials? And example, people talk about AI and so forth. What do you see if you look out in the next 5 years? What are the innovations in the CRO space that will either lower costs or improve, the quality of output?
Well, I think I touched upon a lot of them. I think decentralizing it is going to be one of the major areas, and I think the objective there is not just to decentralize it for the sake of being patient-centric, but to actually improve the recruitment rates. Typically, in a clinical trial, the recruitment time can be several years. Certainly at least a year in many cases, and up to 2 or 3 years. That's time that can be condensed, and that if you take the time out, you reduce the cost. So I think that's the area we have most opportunity. So it's the things that I was talking about really around identifying patients through their health records and the ability to have software and applications, see where they are and bring them in. It's the ability to go out to patients themselves. It's burdensome to get into a clinical trial. Anyone's been in a clinical trial, you're going in probably at least once a month, sometimes much more often than that, to the site. It's a significant burden on a patient to do that. And if we can reduce that burden, I think we can innovate and improve the recruitment rates and then reduce the cost through shortening the time to do those trials.
Yeah, go ahead. One question, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things, having been a sponsor of clinical trials for 2 decades now, that I think companies like yours could provide that would help us is to get information on the background and natural history of the disease we're looking at. Mm. So one of my colleagues near this table is working Parkinson's disease. And one of the things you like to estimate as accurate as possible is what is the natural history of the decline and how variable is it. Yeah. And because you do many trials in a given disease compared to any sponsor company, you'll have a better insight into that. And so a way that you can provide anonymized data from the previous times to show us what treatment effects might be reasonable given the standard of care evolves over years. And you have the latest look at that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Certainly for organisations who do a lot of these clinical development programs, we do have access to that sort of data. So we can do that. I also think there's a way of, as I said, with those synthetic controls, to look at data on a broader basis through health records, a de-identified basis to look at things, because you need, to really get a good sense of what the natural path is. You need thousands of patients, thousands. Now we've probably got, in some diseases, thousands, but there are others that you probably have not so many. It's more like hundreds, and you do need to, I think, go broader than just like any one organisation. I think that's the opportunity.
How's the response been from the FDA around the concept of the synthetic controls? Is that getting close to something that they might allow in place of randomized placebo, or?
I'm not the right person to ask on that one. I haven't had any sort of direct conversations with the FDA. My sense is that the FDA are much more, and particularly FDA, are much more open to those sorts of discussions than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So my sense is around decentralized trials, around electronic records, and around synthetics, they are open to it. Again, we're going to have to show them that it works. We have to show them that we can do it in a de-identified manner, all of those sort of things. But my sense is the regulators are very open to those sorts of discussions.
Almost have to run it as a third arm for
validated. Yeah, that's right.